Well, guys, it's a truly great honor for me to be here at TED. I think not just because it's TED, but because it's in Pretoria. And as was mentioned, I'm from Pretoria. I grew up in Ga-Rankuwa, not too far from here. And I spent my life growing up in this lovely city in the early 80s, mid 80s to 90s. But interestingly, my story doesn't actually start here in Pretoria. I was born in Mafikeng in the Northwest Province, and my family and I spent the first couple of years of my life living in Mabatu. And just for you guys, for some of you guys who might not necessarily know, Mabatu and Mafikeng are on the Northwest Province, quite close to the border with Mafikeng, so quite close to the border with Botswana and so forth. And growing up, I always had families scattered all across the Northwest Province, scattered all across Botswana and so forth. But interestingly, I also had family coming from Botswana. And they would come over for family gatherings, they would come over to visit us even here in Pretoria while we're living here. And the story between us was exactly the same. The guys spoke the exact same language we spoke. We shared the same culture. Even the food was the same. The childhood stories between them and my folks was exactly the same. The only difference between us was that they lived on the other side of the border in Botswana. And so I've always been intrigued. You know, I grew up on this level of these borders, these arbitrary lines between us. I mean, why do they exist? Because I have family on one side that lives on this side, that's exactly like the ones on this side. And I think if you grow up and you ask people who live on the border with Lesotho, with Swaziland and so forth, you're gonna find the stories are exactly the same. It's the same people that have just been divided by an arbitrary line. And so when I got my first passport, which I've brought here, you guys will never probably see this passport again. When I got my first South African passport, I couldn't wait to go and cross and see these borders. And I recall once we were visiting family out in Mafikeng, and I got one of my uncles to go and drop me off at the border, and I hitchhiked some 130 kilometers into Gaborone, Gabs as we call it. And I remember I just spent the day just hitchhiking. I got there and I sat there, I walked around, I spoke to people, and I hitchhiked myself back to the border and crossed back into South Africa. And it was fascinating for me. And what was incredibly fascinating for me was spending time listening to a truck driver who had given me a lift, telling me about how he moves goods between the borders, how he struggles to get goods across different borders from Botswana to Zimbabwe to Zambia and so forth. And it really opened up my mind to a lot around movement of people and movement of things and services in Africa. But it wasn't until I was a student at Wits University, and I was a final student at Wits University, so it was a bit of an anomaly for me to be selected to join a group of volunteers to go across to Mozambique following the floods of 2000. And we went across to Mozambique to do some relief work, helping out the community in the Gaza province. I spent some time in a village called Hogwe in the Gaza province in Mozambique, doing some charity work for a couple of weeks over our winter break as a vet student. And I learned a lot. In addition to just being in a community, understanding and helping people rebuild. I mean, I did a lot of physical work. You'd be surprised looking at me today, but I did a lot of physical work at the time, clearing grounds and clearing, relocating, helping families relocate to other parts of the village that were more high-lying as opposed to the floodplains they were living on. But it really hit me when we did some research around women and child-headed households in Mozambique, that I got to understand the effects of migrant labor and the effects of movement of people. And our theme today is movement, so I wanted to chat about movement of people and movement of ideas. And so it wasn't until then that we got to interview women in the village of Hogwe in Mozambique that I got to understand what actually influenced the movement of people across Africa. And most of the women told me, which was something we realized, you know, almost every household had no man in it. Their husband, the brother, the son, the uncle were all gone. And every single community told us, no, they've gone to Ejoni, as they would call it. Ejoni meaning they've gone to South Africa. And they would tell us, no, my husband is going to work in the mines in South Africa. I haven't seen him in 5 years. My son left, he works in the security sector, in the construction sector. I haven't seen him in all these years. And it left that deep feeling in me that there was something we need to understand about borders and the movement of people on the African continent. And so when I finished university as a finance graduate and I became an investment professional, I've worked for some of the top investment banks in South Africa. I started out with the notion in my head that I had to find a way to link what I was doing on the finance side with this passion I had on borders in Africa and the movement of people and people in Africa. So I had to find a way. And I guess I was lucky. I lived in Cape Town at the time, and I happened to be lucky to be in the investment field. And it was during the time in the in the early 2000s, when the investment world was creating these investment products about investing in Africa. The Economist was coming out saying Africa rising. The narrative about Africa from the 90s to the 2000s was changing. So Africa funds were launching and so forth. And of course, I was one of the first guys to put my hand up and say, I want to run money in Africa. I want to invest money in Africa because that's my contribution to the African continent and to the people of Africa I had met before. And so I've spent the last 10 years or so of my life directly investing money in Africa. I've invested a couple of $1 million across various economies in Africa. I've invested a couple of $1 million in companies in Africa. We've supported cement companies in Africa. We've even listed power companies in Uganda, such as Umeme and so forth. But throughout all that time, traveling across the continent, and I've gone to Egypt, I've gone to Morocco, I've traveled all across the African continent. And the one thing, though, I've done over the years more than anything else is accumulate visas and passports, guys. And I've brought them here again to show you guys as evidence. So I've got all these passports I've accumulated over the last decades. And this has become the biggest hurdle for me and the biggest headache for me than you would believe. I invest money in Africa. We direct money in Africa. But the one thing I've realized, though, about Africa is that the movement of Africans in Africa is more restricted than the movement of anybody else in Africa. For Africans to move around Africa, it actually costs you this. If some of these passports could talk to you guys, they will tell you incredible stories. Amazing stories. I've got a passport here from Nigeria. I've got an Ebola alert on my passport. I've got a passport here in Nigeria. When I first got my 3-year visa in Nigeria, and I got stopped by an official in Nigeria who looked at my passport, waited for like 2 minutes, paged through every single page, looked at me, picked me up from my shoes all the way to the top, and said, 3-year visa. And I say, is that a problem? He says, I've seen longer. Go. Because you know what? I'll tell you why I mentioned this story, because South Africans typically don't get 3-year visas to Nigeria. We get 3-month visas, and if you travel to Nigeria doing business, you're going to have to get 4 visas, which fill up your entire page in your passport for the whole year. So this is important for me to mention. So if you look essentially at the maps of Africa, if you're a South African citizen and you travel with a South African passport, these are essentially the countries you can travel to in Africa without needing a visa. So you can pretty much only travel into Southern Africa and East Africa without needing a visa. This is important for me as a business person, as an investor in Africa, because if I get a phone call right now that I need to be in Zimbabwe tomorrow for a meeting with a minister or with whoever, I need to get there right now. And if I do need a visa, it's going to take me 2-3 weeks to at least get that visa to get there. And that hampers and that increases the cost of us doing business on the African continent. So this is the map for us in South Africa. If you're a Nigerian citizen, you pretty much can't travel anywhere else outside West Africa without needing a visa. The rest of the places you can travel to where you can get a visa on arrival, which is primarily in East Africa. If you're a Kenyan citizen, you can pretty much get around much of West Africa, much of Central Africa, but not so much in East Africa. I mean, a Kenyan citizen needs a visa to come into South Africa, as an example. None of us can get into North Africa, by the way, as you've noticed, without needing a visa. Here's the extreme that I wanted to show you. If you're a Somali citizen, now the Somali passport in Africa is probably the weakest passport in Africa for you to get movement as a person, as a Somali citizen. So if you're a Somali citizen, which is the part in red, you can pretty much only get access visa on arrival. There's no country in Africa, if you're a Somali citizen, that will allow you into that country without a visa. Now, I mention these things. These things are important because these things have a bearing on how we do things in Africa and how we do business in Africa. A friend of mine recently organized a conference through their company in Vic Falls, and they invited business people, corporate people from all over the African continent. And the Nigerians coming to South Africa, or the Nigerians found it, actually, I should say, the Nigerians found it easier to fly through South Africa on their way to Vic Falls in Zimbabwe, as you guys know. Now, the South African government unfortunately declined transit visas. Business people, corporate people who weren't necessarily here to sell drugs or whatever the perception could be, they got rejected. And you know how they had to get there for the conference because it was so important? They had to fly from Nigeria to Kenya, from Kenya to Zambia, from Zambia take a local flight from Lusaka to Livingstone, and then drive across from Livingstone across the border into Zimbabwe, into Vic Falls. Can you imagine the cost of doing business in Africa? If I lived in Europe, I could be sitting having a coffee in Paris, and a friend of mine tells me, come see me in Amsterdam. I'll get on the ferries on the train tomorrow and I'll be in Amsterdam within a couple of hours. No visa, no problems. Now let me tell you why this also matters in terms of trade and investment. In Africa, our trade between countries is at the lowest as anywhere else in the world. So if you look at Europe, which I've just mentioned, the trade between European countries as a percentage of what they do as overall trade sits at about 70%. Trade in Asia, between Asian nations, sits at about 50%. Guess what it is in Africa? 12%. Trade between African nations only sits at 12%. The rest, what do? We get materials and we ship them out of the continent and then we import it back. So we are very good at producing what we don't consume and consuming what we don't produce in Africa. And this is the big problem. And I'll tell you, the issue of visas and the issue of barriers between us is fundamental to why this is the case on the African continent. And so when I look around, I ask myself, why is it that a farmer or a flower grower in Kenya can land flowers on the Amsterdam auction market tomorrow morning, but cannot do that in Tanzania? A flower farmer can't send flowers from Kenya to Tanzania as efficiently and as cheap as sending it to Amsterdam. That doesn't make any sense to me. I was speaking to a cement company in West Africa recently, and they told me it's easier for us to get cement into Ghana from China than it is to get it from Nigeria. Can you guys believe it? For some of you guys who don't know, Nigeria and Ghana only have Togo and Benin in between them, those small little strips in between them. It's cheaper to bring it from Pakistan or China than to bring it from Nigeria. So this is important. This whole issue of intra-trade Africa is important. The whole issue of us discussing why we need to link up is important. And as I mentioned earlier, it's important, one, because of social capital. As I mentioned to you guys earlier, my family sits on both sides of the border. Now that has a true effect and a serious effect on social capital in Africa. It has a serious effect on trust in Africa. There are communities that people I speak to in Ghana who have friends across in Togo who tell me, yeah, my family, we speak the same language on the Togo side. People in Swaziland and Nelspruit, same issues. So we know these borders are arbitrary. And we also know that these borders weren't even drawn by us. 1884, Berlin Conference, the Europeans got together and divided up the African continent within us. But what are we doing instead? We are reinforcing the very same borders we reject, saying we didn't draw them up, by putting on layers, an administrative layer called the visa. And so I'm calling for this visa and this removal of barriers to be removed between us as Africans. And I'll tell you why. I spent some time as a Mandela Washington Fellow this year. I spent some time in Georgia, in Atlanta actually. I never got to see any of the housewives of Atlanta. But I got some time there and I got to understand though, that the way America works, I mean, I was based out in Atlanta in Georgia. And the economy of Georgia as a whole is as big as the economy of South Africa as one state. So what we need to understand as Africans is that we can never compete with China or America or Europe or South America until we understand that moving goods and people between us, and particularly moving ideas between us, is the key to solving all of our issues in Africa and solving our prosperity and increasing our prosperity and growth in Africa. So I'm a man of capital. I direct capital in Africa. If you ask me what my life's purpose is, I'll tell you is to catch butterflies. Because catching capital across the world is like catching butterflies, guys. You're asking Americans, Chinese, rich people from the Middle East to give you money to invest it in Africa. And it's a hard story to tell at times because we're not selling it ourselves. It's very difficult for anybody to believe that they should invest in Africa if we ourselves aren't investing in our own countries and trading amongst ourselves and creating the dialogue between ourselves. So my life as a Mandela Washington Fellow has taught me that, guys, we need to interact. Because I realized, chatting to young Africans from all across the African continent, that our struggles are the same. Our solutions are the same. We just have to find a way to increase dialogue between us. One of my favorite points to end up with is one by Robert Frost called Mending Wall. And he asked a question in the poem, what are we trying, or who are we trying to wall or fence in or fence out? So let's ask ourselves a deep question. When we have these borders in Africa, who exactly are we fencing in and who exactly are we fencing out and why? And does it really matter for our own prosperity? And I put it to you that yes, it does, and it's up to you to go out there and make a change. Thank you.